Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film but to almost entirely focus on the quality of the 3D on offer, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at Ang Lee's 2019 film Gemini Man. This has an aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1, and very unusually for the last few years, this was shot in native 3D. Not only was this filmed with 3D cameras, but it was Ang Lee's second film to have been shot at high frame rate, 120 frames a second. But this Blu-ray, of course, is the usual 24 frames a second. So, as mentioned, it's Ang Lee's second high frame rate film, and it's his third 3D film. There are a few directors out there with more 3D films under their belts, but 3 natively shot ones should make Lee something of an expert. There's no doubt that there's some great 3D in this film. At the beginning, there's this really strong shot where not only does the back of the train stretch back deep into the frame, but the front emerges quite far out in front of it. Same thing here as it's about to go into this tunnel. It's a strong and powerful piece of 3D, really nice stuff. Because this was right at the start of the film, it set my hopes up a bit for plenty more of the same. There was a bit more, but maybe not plenty. The film does deliver some pop-out, but it looked to me like it was more about creating natural-looking 3D than pop-out shots. So when we first see Will Smith, his gun sight fills three-dimensional space in a very solid and convincing way. It's nice when everything in the frame feels like it's at different depth. And like the train, the scope here is both behind and in front of the screen. When we see his point of view, they've taken the decision to break a little bit with accuracy and show the crosshairs in 3D space in front of the view. This happens actually several times in the film, and the view always has the same 3D effect with the crosshairs. It's not something that you're going to see when looking down a scope with just one eye. Still, I'm not complaining at all. It's 3D, and that's what I'm here for, rather than an accurate presentation of the world necessarily. That last view through the telescopic sights is during a scene with all of these flags, and they look like they should present some nice 3D views, but for whatever reason we don't get any, which I thought was a bit of a surprise and a bit of a shame that their obvious 3D composition wasn't fully exploited. Another oddly disappointing moment was this drone, which I'd have expected to occupy 3D space in a much more obvious way than it does. It's only very slightly in front of the world below it, in a surprisingly mild piece of 3D, so it's not floating out in front of the screen like you might hope it would. Some of the other pop-out moments are provided by guns, lots of guns in this film, and we get several shots of guns held up in close-up negative parallax. In every one of these examples, though, the gun is out of focus, which I think always slightly diminishes the 3D effect, and what diminishes it even more is when it isn't entirely in the frame, like it is here. So the gun pops in this film aren't really amongst the best that I've seen. There's a very strong bit of pop in this view of a tripwire. Like some of those other shots, this has plenty of positive and negative parallax in the shot, and it's held here for a good long moment, so this is a bit of fun 3D that can be fully enjoyed. Some of the other pop-outs are done in the all too frequently sort of blink and you'll miss it style, like a knife that very briefly flashes out of the screen, and these sparks which pop very nicely but also very quickly, too quickly for my tastes. Lee does go slow motion a few times, so this view can be fully enjoyed and it's quite impressive, as it does what I think 3D needs to do to properly excel, and that's to pack the frame with detail, all of which occupies separate space. And when I say detail, I mean every little spark as well as the other bits of debris flying around. And even better is this shot doing the same thing, and I think this is absolutely the standout shot of the film. It's also in slow motion. There's loads of stuff being hurled towards and out of the screen. It's very, very good. There's a great location here where all the rows of lamps are an obvious choice to work well in 3D, and they look pretty good in this view, and even better in this one. It's quite a short scene, but I assume this location was chosen precisely because of those lamps. Some of the underwater scenes look really good, mainly because of all of the bubbles, which are very clearly defined, and I think that these shots are at their best, like here, where the camera's half in and half out of the water. There are quite a lot of scenes in the film where it feels like they've done a very purposeful job of composing the frame for the benefit of 3D, to create a good feeling of depth. Whilst I think all of these views are nicely composed, they're not exactly strong 3D, they just offer a pleasant bit of depth, but all at what looks to me like a very natural level, so it's nothing to really dazzle you. It's not extreme depth, just serviceable depth. And following on from that, Ang Lee doesn't appear to be a fan of hyper-stereo views. In the handful of shots where you might see some films ramp up the interaxial to a wildly unnatural level, and that's the type of 3D that I love the most, it's not something that's ever done here. So again, the views here are natural, which means they're of no real significance as far as 3D is concerned. There is a shot that looked to me like it might have had a slightly wider interaxial here when Will Smith suddenly gets an inkling of what's going on. So it's a moment of dramatic revelation with the camera moving towards him, and it looked to me like it was slightly stronger 3D than the film's other close-ups, and if that's the case, it was a good moment to ramp it up, even if just ever so slightly. A scene that set something up but then failed to deliver was this one. Now, they put the digital Will Smith in a mask, so I assume part of the reason to do that actually was to save on actually making him digital and just to use some bloke with the right build and haircut. And they've given him these special vision goggles, which look like they've got an extra wide interocular. But when we see his point of view shot, it didn't look to me like it was quite as deep as it should have been based on that wider interocular. Another area where I thought the 3D suffered a bit was in most of the dialogue delivery scenes, and whilst the faces do have some solidity, albeit not quite as much as you sometimes see, it did feel like there were an awful lot of shots like this where people are talking to each other, and there's not really anything particularly interesting about the 3D. It's always clear that the background is a layer behind them. Maybe it was because these shots failed to impress in 3D that I noticed them so much, but there did seem to be more of these shots than usual, and I'd cite these as the main reason why I wouldn't class this as a film that was obviously entirely planned and created as a 3D experience. One of the other views I liked a lot were these little bonsai trees, which look great, but they do still look small, so it's not a shot with a minuscule interaxial to make them look like full-size trees, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. I think the film's best-known set piece is when the two Smiths go up against each other in a noisy two-stroke motorbike duel. I thought it was a fine action sequence, but not a particularly fine 3D scene. It was okay, but it was nothing special, and the strongest 3D shot in the sequence I thought was this one, which isn't exactly a thrilling view. And it might be worth mentioning the high frame rate at this point, because this bike chase was a scene that was particularly supposed to benefit from it. I did see this film at the cinema in HFR, although in 60 rather than 120 frames per second. And some people seem to love high frame rate, and others say they hate it. I'm not one of those people who love it, and hate may be a strong word, although I have to admit, for me, it's not strong enough. I detest and despise high frame rate, and to me, it's by far the worst thing to ever happen to cinema. Technically, it looks incredible, of course, but I think it utterly robs the film of any cinematic magic, and it just feels like you're there on the set watching a rehearsal. It could be that I'm just used to 24 frames per second, of course, and I'm resistant to change, and certainly I've always used the argument that if by some sort of weird quirk of camera technology, films had always been in 3D from the earliest days of cinema, and then if a few years ago someone had managed to create some sort of way of shooting films with just one camera so they could be made in 2D, that person would have been laughed out of town. So by the same logic, if films had been in 48, 60 or 120 frames per second from day one, and then that same imaginary idiot had come up with the suggestion for shooting at 24 frames a second, he would very similarly have been hounded out of town for lunacy. But I do actually think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and I genuinely believe that the very heart of film is the grain of celluloid and a frame rate that's just sufficiently slow enough to create something that's distinct from reality, which is, after all, that's what acting itself is meant to be. It's not supposed to be indistinguishable from reality, but something just a little bit different. And now that celluloid is mostly gone, it's only 24 frames per second that lets films retain their cinematic feel. It's almost 10 years now since The Hobbit came out, and I think there have only been a couple of HFR films since then, both of which were made by Ang Lee. So fortunately, from my point of view, it does feel like filmmakers don't like it either, and I'm one of those people who desperately hopes that James Cameron is quietly dropping his plans to create his Avatar sequels in this format. Anyway, that's just my opinion on HFR, and if you're a fan of it, that's great, and I'd recommend the 4K disc of Gemini Man, which I've had a look at, and it looks pretty much the same as it did at the cinema, although it's 60, not 120 frames a second, and of course not in 3D. And whilst I personally think that Gemini Man would look better if it had been filmed on Super 8 Cinefilm at 18 frames a second than in 4K high frame rate, I do think that it looks infinitely better at 24 frames a second than it did at 60, even if it means that technically the 3D isn't as sharp or as smooth as it was at the cinema. So, a very quick word about the film itself. When it came out, I think most critics chose to take the line about no amount of technical gimmicks being able to help the weak story, and it is a bit weak, really. It's a bit silly. It's something that I'm not necessarily against, but it all felt a little bit minor. The digital Will Smith, though, was often amazing, a genuinely incredible technical achievement that could maybe 99% convince us being real. In fact, I'd say that if you could find somebody to show the film to who doesn't know who Will Smith is and who knew nothing about the film, I think they might possibly not realise that they've just watched a digital character. And I thought that Will Smith, the real Will Smith, and Mary Elizabeth Winstead were both quite engaging. Benedict Wong was fun, although Clive Owen and Ralph Brown, both of whom are great actors, they seemed strangely a little bit off to me. Overall, it didn't really feel like a big expensive film. It was quite low-key in a way, with some okay, maybe quite good, if not super impressive action sequences. As a 3D Blu-ray, there's obviously enough to recommend it. There's some great 3D in the film, even if some of it is not all that special, and it looks likely that it's going to end up being one of the very last natively shot 3D films from this era. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now, bye-bye.